Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me, whether you're watching live or you're watching the recording. I appreciate you watching today. Today we are going to be talking about JavaScript events. We're going to be breaking away from the headache of last week, although I bet you all are getting a little bit better at your JavaScript syntax after getting a lot of practice in on creating everything in JavaScript, which is what your JavaScript lab last week had to do with. All right, got you out of your comfort zone a little bit there, got you practicing a lot of JavaScript syntax. It was almost like learning HTML again, wasn't it? That was one of the big goals there. And so now we're going to talk about events. And really, when it comes to events, the event is a really big thing when it comes to JavaScript. And so we're going to talk about events for a little bit today, and we're going to do a lot of practice, and we're going to develop a site here today that's going to help us out a lot in terms of being able to kind of understand what's going on and working with events and working with these things that we're going to be dealing with kind of going forward. Right, because this plus last week really gets us everything that we need to know. Right, so just what exactly is an event? And we talk about the idea of events in a lot of classes, right? And so events are actions or occurrences that happen in the system you are programming, right? So when we think about an event, we're basically thinking about something that happens. A tap, a click, a hover, a focus, even just an amount of time passing. That's an event. And when an event happens, then we can respond to that event in some way. Right? So as we create an event, or as we are listening for an event to happen, would probably be the better way to put that, right? So there's an event that might be happening. We are waiting for it to happen. When it does happen, we trigger something else to happen, right? We respond and we cause something else to happen. For example, like if a user selects a button on a website, we might want to respond to that action by displaying some sort of information box on our website. Right, so in the case of the web, events are fired inside the browser window. Right, that kind of gets back to, basically the basics of everything that we talk about when we talk about websites and how they're rendered. How the browser is kind of at the core of everything that, happens there. So our browser is listening for an event to happen. When that event happens, we're running some kind of JavaScript. And when that JavaScript happens, then we respond, and that's the response, I guess, is the better way to put that. Instead of saying we respond, that JavaScript is the response, and then some new thing occurs. And so these are some event examples, some things that could be considered events. One is that the user selects a certain element or hovers the cursor over a certain element. Right? We've talked about the hover event a lot, utilizing other languages and other markup. Right? We used the hover pseudo class previously, right? For when we were hovering over something with CSS. Right, we could use the hover pseudo class to be able to make changes to certain elements. If you've already done Web 140, you know that we did hover with jQuery in there. Right, now we're going to be dealing with hover again. We've dealt with hover with JavaScript in the past as well. Right, in Web 115 and in CTI 110. We dealt with hover, And we talked about how hover was really a two property event, an on mouse enter and an on mouse leave. Right now we're going to be dealing with it again, and we're going to be dealing with it in a slightly different way. But the event still occurs. Right, the user chooses a key on a keyboard. When the user sits and they press a key on the keyboard, that's an event. Right, oh, here's the H key on my keyboard. I'm going to press it. That can cause something to happen. The user resizes or even closes the browser window. That's an event. That can cause something to happen. When a web page finishes loading, this is something that we talk about a lot with jQuery in Web 140, right? We say that when the document is ready, we run the function. Right? Well, that's, one of our events that we're talking about here. When the web page finishes loading, when the document is ready. When a form is submitted. When a video is played or paused or finishes. When an error occurs, right? We can do error handling here. There's a lot of stuff that we can do with these events. And there are different types of events, and these are our event listeners, essentially. These are just some of the events that we can deal with, right? And some of these are also listed in your module. We see on click, double click, mouse down, mouse up, key down, key up, touch move, touch start, touch end, on load, on focus, on blur, on error, on scroll. Right, like some of these things didn't exist until about, 12, 13, 14 years ago, right? Like touch, move. Till the proliferation of touch screens. Right, we didn't really see some of these things exist. But we'll do some examples with some of these as we kind of progress. And this is just a sampling of them. And as I said, there's even more of them in your module. But these are all different types of events that we can see. And so what happens is when an event happens, and we kind of get a little fancy here, when an event happens, an event goes through phases. And an event moves through the DOM through what we call propagation. And so an event actually propagates through the DOM tree. It can either be captured, or it can... So the event can be captured, and then it can bubble, and it can actually trickle down through the capture phase. So trickling down or bubbling up is essentially the two ways that our DOM can move through the DOM tree. So when we think about moving through the DOM tree, right, we can think about, it can either go up from the bottom, it can go from the child element up to the parent element, or it can go from the top down. It can go from the parent element down to the child element. And so going from the top down, that's the capture phase. We also call this the trickling phase, right? The event trickles down to the element that caused the event. So it starts to propagate from the root level, from the parent element, and then propagates down to the element where it needs to kind of do its thing. So we can kind of look at this, we call it the capture phase because we can almost think of it as like a chase. More so than the trickle, right? Because when we think about the trickling down, it's coming down from the parent, coming down to the child where the event was kind of triggered off, or the target if you will. So when the chaser reaches the target or captures the target, then the capture phase is complete. So it is going from the top to the bottom, and we can kind of say it is trickling down in that sort of way. But that's kind of where we get this capture phase from, is that it's this targeted element, and we're kind of going after it, and we're trying to catch it. And so this is actually a more, it's a less common way that we kind of deal with elements, right? Is to deal with them through the capture phase. More commonly, we deal with them through the bubbling phase. We deal with them and we bubble up through the DOM tree. So we can kind of say that it's captured by the innermost handler. The one that's closest to the element where the event occurred. And then it propagates up to the higher levels of the DOM tree, to the parents, and then finally to the root. Right? So it goes and it kind of spreads outward from here. And all events bubble by default. And for our purposes and what we're dealing with, that's not really big, important information that we need to kind of understand. Right? For our purposes, what we really need to understand are handlers and listeners. Every event has two things. Every event has a handler, and every event has a listener. The event handler is a block of code that runs when the event fires. So when the event happens, the handler is the code that runs. The event listener is the code that listens for the event to happen. So we establish a listener, and that listener is listening for an event to happen. And then when that event happens, it runs the code that is the handler, that takes care of the event and does the action that is in response to the event. And so that's the big thing that we need to worry about here. So let's just jump over to a Visual Studio Code window here, and let's just work in some Visual Studio Code here for just a little bit. We'll figure this out through VS Code, do some examples. I'm just going to build a site kind of from scratch today. Oh, what is the name of this directory? All uppercase with a space. And we'll go ahead and initialize Git in here. All right, so this week we get to use Java or get to use HTML again. So I hope, or I think you all are probably pretty happy about that. So let's go ahead and create just a little form that will allow us to work with some HTML here. What I'd like to do is just create a little login form really quickly. So let's create a little login form. That we can kind of work with here. So what I want to do is we'll create a little header. We'll create a main. And we'll create a footer. Now in our main will be a CSS grid area. What I would like to do in there is we'll make a bit of a grid template here. So let's make kind of two sections inside of here. Our first section will have the ID of hero to be our hero content. And the second one will have the ID of login for our login information. Now let's add our link href equals style.css type equals text/css rel equals style sheet. And in our style sheet file here, let's just take and we'll focus our asterisk selector. We will box sizing border box. We will margin 0. We will padding 0. We will font family sans serif for now. We might change that font up a little bit. And let's take our main. We will display grid. For right now, we're just kind of doing some HTML and CSS. Grid template columns. So what I would like to do, I think, is make this like 1 frame, 4 frame, or maybe 6 frame, 4 frame, 1 frame, and then in our grid template areas, we can dot hero, or actually we want to put that in quotes, dot hero form dot. All right, so now when we hashtag hero, we can grid area hero, And hashtag form grid area form. We will min height 70 VH. We'll take our header and our footer, and we will min height 15 VH, and we will give those a background color of just a dark gray. Fa22. Well, I called that login and not form, so let's go back and change that to hashtag login there. And let's open this in our live server so we can see it. Bring that over here. Let's give our main a background. Background color. Let's go for like a magenta. HSL 300. 90%. 90%. That's too light. Let's go 50%. 50% is where we want it to be. We might change that later on. Background color of our login we will make white. So now our site looks like this. Right, just the standard site. We can resize it. Right, obviously for a media query, if we got below probably this wide, we'd want to flip it around. But it's fine. And like, actually, let's go ahead and put a gradient background on here. I've been into these hero gradient backgrounds. Things like this right here. csshero.org/mesher. You can just kind of randomize and get a different gradient background, and it'll export you the CSS code for it. I've been really into this here lately because I think it can get you some cool looking backgrounds. I kind of like that, so I'm going to export that. And I can just copy that to the clipboard and paste that in my main instead of my background color there. Right, like that. And that'll get me a cool looking background there. Box shadow. Let's give it a little box shadow. 10 pixels. No offset. 10 pixel blur. RGBA 0.2. I think that's what I want. Yep, there's that box shadow there on the right hand side. And we could just put a comma here, V here, and minus there. And that will get it for the other side. Right, I think I might want that a little bit lighter, so we'll just take that down to maybe 0.1. Right, just to do a really quick example here. Very good. I might make, you know what, let's, since we're just kind of building this now, one of the things I might want to do is just make this gray a little bit darker, just so those kind of pastel colors pop a little bit more. Like that a little bit better. And so this is just kind of our hero for our login page that we're building. We're going to jump back to our PowerPoint in just a moment. In our hero section here, let's put an H1. We'll add some text like log in to our, maybe we'll put a break in here. All right. So now let's add our form. Our form is going to give us a lot of things to interact with. Right, so we'll add our form into our login area here. And so it's these things that are going to give us our elements that are going to need, or that are going to be our event listeners. So we're going to add a form. Input type equals text. ID equals uname for username. We'll also give it a name of uname. And that's a self-closing. And input type equals text. ID equals pass. Name equals pass. And actually, instead of type equals text here, what we would want to use is we'd actually want to use type equals password. And that would give us those dotted inputs there instead of the instead of actually showing it to us by default. And then we will add a button here. And by default, we will just add a click to submit. Right, just a really simple form. And so before we get into writing some JavaScript, let's just add some CSS to our form. right, that's better. So this is our site. Right, we have the ability to enter some text here, enter a password, and click a button. Really standard, basic login site. So let's say, for example, you entered your username, you forgot to enter your password, and you click submit. Right? This is something that we're going to want to do. Or actually, I don't think we want to do that yet, right? Because we're not gonna do conditionals until the future. Or are we doing conditionals yet? No, we're not doing conditionals until the future. So what are we doing right now? Let's do some examples that we can do, or that we're supposed to be able to do. That's something we'll have to save for next week. So let's think about, okay, we're going to log into our site. We've got this text over here. Log into our site. That's our H1. That's in. Our hero. So let's start off by writing a function. Right? And I'm going to write an arrow notation function, which I believe we get to We've discussed functions in the past. I want to show you an arrow notation function, and we'll show you kind of how it's different or the same. Right? Because in the past we've written functions before. In JavaScript, we'd write the keyword function, and we would give our function a name, something like change hero text, and we might, we'd give it some parentheses, and we might give it an argument or a parameter in here, some kind of parameter. If we needed to do something where we needed to take some sort of data from outside of the function and bring it into the function. But in this case, we don't need to do that. So that's fine. All in this case we would need to do is be able to select that H1. So that's our hero H1. And so in this case, remember, it's like we talked about last week with our query selector. I'm going to document.query selector. And in parentheses here, we can select that element in the exact same way that we would select it in HTML. So it is the hero, and we can use the advanced child selector for H1, right? So that's going to use the child selector for the H1. And then we can enter HTML, and we can change the text inside of that to something like login successful. Right, or something like that. And so we'll do that on button click. Right, and so this is an example of what we'll do here. And so we have a function, and this function is our event handler. This function is what we're going to do when our event runs. So what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to listen to an event. And so in order to listen to an event, we need to select the element that we are going to be attaching our event to. In the case of this slide, what we're looking at here is we are attaching it to a link, an anchor link, document.getElementById, by ID, or by tag in this case, add event listener, click on click handler. So in this case, we are attaching the click event, and we are running the on click handler. Event whenever this link is clicked. Now in the past, we've attached listeners like this, right? You might remember doing it like this, right? Where we did on click equals on click handler, and then it would run that function. Right, well now we're going to use the add event listener function. It's a little bit easier, a little bit nicer, a little bit friendlier, will help us out in the future. So document.querySelector, right? We can use that, get element by ID, get element by tag name, get element by class name, any selection method that we would use. And we're going to focus our button in this case. So in this case, our button is just called button. So document.querySelector button .enter or .add event listener, add event listener. And this button, we're going to do the .click event, and we are going to run our change hero text function. And it is just as simple as that. Right? So whenever we click this button, it will run this function. Right? So now if I go to my live site, I click to submit. And got a bit of an issue here. I'm sure I just made some sort of error somewhere. Let's see if I can figure out what I did wrong. Oh, what did I do? Oh. This is all good. This is actually one of the ways that we can learn, because I can test this and see if things are working, right? And this is a good way that we can all kind of figure things out together. So one of the things that I would usually do is I would do a console.log inside of my function that I'm trying to run. And I would just put, some sort of message in there where if that message shows up in my console, then I know that this function fired off and this worked correctly, and that's not the issue. So it's, kind of shows me where the problem is. And so I'm running here, and I think what's happening here is it is returning. So I think I might need to add a return false here to this function. And that might be what I need to do. Is it refreshing? I cannot tell. Oh, you know what I haven't done? Anybody out there watching, tell me what I haven't done that makes me feel silly. See, I for those of you who are watching, right, I do it too, right? Script src equals script.js. Kind of need that link to that JavaScript in there in order for that to work. Now it is returning. We can see it change that. So now if we add our return false, that should fix that. Shoot. That return false should fix that. Why is that not fixing that? Think. I think if I add type equals button here, that might help. There we go. When it's a part of a form like this, whenever I put it inside of a form, that's always something I forget too when I try to do things like this. Whenever I have a button on its own, and don't have it inside of a form, you don't have to do that. Whenever I have a button inside of a form, I need to make sure to add type equals button. And that's something that you all need to remember as well. And so now I think I can remove the return false as well. And that should just work fine. Good. Good, all fixed. Right, so we have our function here, our regular function. We're able to just do something very simple, right? We selected our element. We're putting the inner HTML into it, right? Whereas last week when we were doing that, what we would have done is we'd have put that in there automatically whenever the site loaded. But this time what we're doing is we're putting it in there just whenever this event listener happens. So let's do something a little bit different. Let's look at that button, and let's change the text that we put in that button. You know, maybe right now it's click to submit, but maybe if it's something else. Right, so let's write ourselves a function. This time I'll write an arrow notation function for you all, so you can see that. So that's const. So our arrow notation functions, we write them and they look a little bit more like variables or constants, right? We start with our constant keyword, or we can also start with our variable keyword. The next thing that we would do is we would give it a name. We could say change button text, and we can set that equal to a pair of parentheses, right? Which is what initializes it as a function, and then we can add our arrow, and it's an equal sign and an arrow, and that is our arrow notation there. And then we can add curly braces just like we were adding a regular function. And so that's just a different way to write a function in JavaScript. Which really the only real difference between a function like this and our arrow notation function is that our arrow notation function, the way they use the this keyword is different, which we'll talk more about the this keyword in the future, because our arrow notation function is not constructible, meaning we can't kind of turn our arrow notation functions into objects. Otherwise, they're exactly the same. Right, so that's not even a big deal to us right now. Right, so all I'd want to do is be able to select my button. So we will document .query selector button. And we can just put some different text on it. We'll just put hovered text. Now the thing here is that, just kind of like before, right? Like that we've talked about when we're dealing with a hover. A hover is two parts. So it is a mouse enter and a mouse leave. So we're going to add another event listener here for a mouse enter this time. And we are going to add our change button text function here. So notice that it's just click and it's just mouse enter instead of on click and on mouse enter. So now if I go here and I hover, you can see that when I hover over it, it says hovered text. Now when my mouse leaves, I didn't write a function to change it back, right? So it just stays the same. But you can also see that when I click that button, it still changes this text over here. So let's write another function that will quickly change it back. We'll call it change button back. And we'll set it equal to empty parentheses. We'll do our arrow function notation here again. We'll just use our same code. And we'll take our text, click to submit. And put it here in place of hovered text. And now we can just add another event listener here. Instead of mouse enter, this one will be for mouse leave. And for instead of change button text, this will be change button back. And now when we visit our site, we can see hovered text. And when we go off of it, it changes back. And when we click it, it still changes to login successful. Now I've got one more thing I'd like to do, and that is I would like to add a little box here. I'd like to add something to this. Maybe putting login successful over here doesn't make sense, but maybe changing this from login to our site to welcome to our site would make a little bit more sense. So let's try that. Instead of login to our site, we'll change this to welcome to our site. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to put a little box underneath it here that says login successful. Right, so we'll do another little click event that will add a box here that'll use some of the things that we talked about last week. Right, so let's do another function. Right, we'll use just another standard function again. You can choose to write your functions in whichever way is most comfortable for you. So this will be function add login success. And what we will do is we will say document.create element section document.create text node login successful, and we actually need to var s equals var t equals, getting a little bit ahead of myself there, as I'm prone to do, right? S dot append child T document dot query selector. We want our form section here, so this is our login section. Hashtag login dot append child S. Now another thing that we could do here is we could say before we append it, we could add a class. So we could say s dot class list dot add success, and we want that in quotes. Right, so now in our CSS, if we made a dot success, we could add some, color green, font, size 3VW, right, width 100%, padding. And I don't think I want it to be 100%. I want it to be like 80%. Padding 12 pixels, margin 0, auto, min, height. Or you know what I'll do? I'll do aspect ratio 1:1. Right, so now when we get that, oh, we haven't added our event listener yet, have we? We need to add another event listener, so we can just add as many event listeners as we want. Document.query selector button. This is going to be another click event listener. Add event listener click. And this time we are going to do add login success. So now if we did everything correctly, we should see, okay, everything else is still working, right? We still get our hovered text there. And if we click, we get login successful, nice and big and green there. Right? Welcome to our site there. Right, we can take and we can extend this once we get some conditionals and once we get some loops and things of that nature, right, which we'll add to our repertoire next week. Another thing that we could do here is, for example, we could add focus and blur. Right, so if I could add function, focus, input, document.query selector. Although actually that would be a little bit more helpful if I knew my loops and such. But I'll tell you what, just for a let's do one here where we use a bit of a loop so that we can kind of bridge the gap toward next week. So I'll use document.query selector all for inputs. And so that's going to return everything in my page with an input, but it's going to return it as an array. So I'm going to actually create this as a variable input equals, or actually I'm going to call this variable n because input is a thing. Variable n equals document.query selector all input. Or we'll say I, because n is also something. Variable I, document.query selector all input. For let a of I if a equals document dot active, and I need to put this in. If a equals document dot active element, a dot style dot border equals 3 pixels solid red. All right, so just kind of a, going forward here. And I didn't really prep any of this today. I'm just kind of going off the top of my head here. And so you know what? I think I might be barking up the wrong tree here, so I'm just going to go ahead and remove this, just so I don't confuse you all next week. But we've got some good examples here of some events and how we would implement them, right? And I think if I check let me just check the course really quickly. Pull that up. A form, a submit button. We can do a specific field for focus. So like if we wanted to do a specific field for focus for password. You could do that. Again, that's just going to be a focus. Event there. But I think overall I've kind of showed you some of the tools here that would help. For example, one of the things that we might want to do here that would be kind of interesting, right? If I wanted to, say, get rid of this form here, maybe I could create a class called .hide and add a display none here, right? So if I were to, in addition to showing this login successful message, add a document.query selector form .class list .add hide to that, right? And then I would hypothetically, right, if we did that correctly, because I forgot to save my CSS file. It is getting really late in the day. It would get rid of the form there, which would be pretty useful for us. And give us a little bit of a message there. So, yeah. That'll be where we will stop for today. So I'll give you all this code. When I give you all the video. A little bit out of sorts today. A little bit of a weird day, but it's okay. We'll get better. Again, I want to thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know. We'll hang out in the chat for a couple minutes just in case anybody who's watching live has any questions that I can answer today. As always, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.